Frank Lucas built a legend that reached Hollywood. Bumpy Johnson built Harlem before him. And when Lucas's version of their relationship became famous, the woman who knew Bumpy best said one thing. That wasn't how it happened. The world, July 7, 1968. Harlem was still awake. It was the kind of hour when the storefront lights stayed on, even though most of the neighborhood had gone quiet. The sidewalks were thinner now. The traffic had softened. Inside the late-night restaurants, waitresses moved between tables while coffee burned beneath the lights. At Wells' restaurant on 7th Avenue, Ellsworth, Raymond Johnson, was eating. Bumpy Johnson was 62 years old. The man who had spent decades building a reputation in Harlem was sitting with friends, eating the kind of food that belonged to the neighborhood around him. Chicken, hominy grits, coffee. Nothing about the scene needed to announce what was coming. Then his hand went to his chest. Bumpy collapsed. It was shortly before 2 in the morning. Within moments, the man whose name had been spoken in Harlem for more than 3 decades was gone. He had died of a heart attack while under federal indictment for drug conspiracy. That was the end of Bumpy Johnson. But it wasn't the end of Bumpy Johnson's story, because by the time he died, another name was beginning to rise: Frank Lucas. And years later, Lucas would tell a story about Bumpy that would become almost impossible to separate from the legend itself. A mentor, a father figure, a man who had supposedly taken a young Lucas under his wing and shown him how Harlem worked. The problem was that not everybody who knew Bumpy remembered it that way. His widow, May Johnson, remembered something very different. And that disagreement matters, because this isn't really a story about whether one gangster was tougher than another. It is about what happens when one generation inherits the reputation of another. Harlem had been teaching men that lesson long before Frank Lucas arrived. Bumpy had learned it the hard way. He was born Ellsworth Raymond Johnson in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1905. When he was still a child, his family sent him north to Harlem after his older brother became the target of a murder accusation, and the family feared what might happen to him in the South. By his teenage years, Harlem was no longer simply a place where Bumpy lived. It was the place that shaped him. He dropped out of high school. He worked odd jobs. He fought. He drifted toward the people who controlled the streets, and eventually, Gangster William Bub Hewlett noticed him. That was how the education began, not in a classroom on corners. In back rooms, around, people understood that power in Harlem did not always belong to the man with the biggest gun or the loudest voice. Sometimes it belonged to the man who knew everybody. Bumpy learned the value of information. He learned the value of patience. He learned which doors opened for money, which opened for fear, and which opened simply because someone respected the person standing outside. And Harlem was changing around him. The numbers racket was enormous. Italian organized crime had its own structure. Black operators had their own territory and influence. Politicians watched, police watched, federal agents watched, and everybody watched everybody else. Bumpy's importance came from surviving inside that machinery without disappearing into it. He became associated with the Harlem numbers operation and developed a reputation that eventually reached far beyond the neighborhood. But there was another side to the man. People who knew his history remembered that Bumpy could be generous to Harlem residents. He gave away food during holidays. He helped people who were struggling. His public reputation became a contradiction, feared by some, respected by others, and remembered by many as a man who could move between worlds that normally refused to touch. That contradiction would become important later, because when Hollywood eventually told the story of Bumpy Johnson, The criminal became larger than the man. The myth became cleaner, simpler, more dramatic, but real power is rarely simple. Bumpy's life was full of interruptions: arrests, prison, federal investigations. Years away from Harlem, in 1951, he received a 15-year sentence for conspiring to sell heroin and served most of that sentence at Alcatraz. He returned to Harlem in 1963, only 5 years before his death. That fact alone creates a problem for one of the most famous stories about him. Frank Lucas later claimed a long, close relationship with Bumpy, but Bumpy wasn't continuously walking Harlem's streets during the years Lucas later described. And Mame Johnson noticed the contradiction. She would eventually say that Frank Lucas had exaggerated his place inside Bumpy's world. According to Mime, Lucas was never part of Bumpy's inner circle in the way later accounts suggested. She rejected the idea that Lucas lived with them, rejected the famous movie version of their relationship, and disputed Lucas's claim to have been Bumpy's longtime driver. That doesn't mean Bumpy and Lucas never knew each other. They did even biographies that describe Lucas as Bumpy's protégé acknowledge that the closeness of the relationship is disputed. Lucas said Bumpy took him under his wing. Mame Johnson said Bumpy never trusted him to that degree, and that is where the story becomes interesting, because the question isn't simply who was telling the truth. The better question is, why did the story need Bumpy Johnson in the first place? Frank Lucas would eventually become famous for building his own drug empire, but before Hollywood knew Frank Lucas, Harlem already knew Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy's name had weight before Lucas's name became national. That distinction matters. A young man entering Harlem did not walk into an empty room. He walked into a room where people already remembered who had survived, who had been arrested, who had gone away, who had returned, who had enemies, who had friends, who could be trusted, and who could not. Frank Lucas entered that world as a younger man. Bumpy was already an institution. That is the part people often miss when they reduce the story to one gangster replacing another. Bumpy's greatest asset was never simply territory. It was memory. He knew what Harlem had looked like before the younger men arrived. He knew which alliances had survived the decades. He knew how quickly confidence could become recklessness, and he understood something that younger men often learn only after it costs them. A reputation doesn't disappear just because the man carrying it gets old. By the 1960s, Bumpy was no longer the young street fighter who had first made his name. His body had endured prison. His years had accumulated. His enemies had multiplied. His government files had grown. And the city around him was changing. Harlem was entering another era. The civil rights movement had transformed the political landscape. Young black activists were challenging old institutions. New criminal organizations were becoming more aggressive. Drugs were changing the economics of the street. The old arrangements were under pressure, and somewhere inside that changing Harlem was Frank Lucas. The younger man was watching, learning, building. Whether he was truly Bumpy's protégé or simply someone who had spent time around him, Lucas understood that the old Harlem system had already revealed something valuable. Power belonged to the person who understood the network, not just the product, not just the money, the network. That distinction would matter enormously, because Bumpy's world had never been built by one man alone. It was built through relationships, and relationships were difficult to inherit. You could inherit a building. You could inherit money. You could inherit a territory. But you couldn't automatically inherit the trust that had taken decades to build. That was the invisible thing Frank Lucas was walking toward. and Bumpy knew exactly how fragile it was. Maybe that is why the later mythology feels so strange. The story became one of a young man learning from an old king, then becoming bigger, then taking his place. It is a satisfying story, almost too satisfying, because history rarely works that cleanly. Bumpy died in 1968. Lucas's greatest years would come afterward. And yet Bumpy's name never disappeared. It survived the newspapers. It survived the courtroom records. It survived prison. It survived Hollywood. It survived the men who claimed to know him. And eventually, it survived the man who became famous, partly because the world wanted to know what Bumpy had taught him. That is the first contradiction. The younger man became famous by telling the story of the older man. But the older man's widow spent years telling people that the story had been changed, and somewhere between those two versions was the real Harlem, the Harlem that existed before the cameras, before the movie, before the legend, before anyone decided who had replaced whom. Because on July 7, 1968, Bumpy Johnson didn't lose a war to Frank Lucas. He didn't step aside. He didn't publicly surrender his position. He sat down to eat. His heart failed. And Harlem woke up the next morning without him. That was the real beginning of the question, if Bumpy was finished. Why did his name become even harder to escape? Microhook. The old king was dead. The younger man was still standing. But the room Bumpy left behind was not empty. Someone was going to have to inherit it. And that was where the real trouble began. Bumpy Johnson did not look like a man who needed to prove anything. That was part of the problem. The younger men understood movement. Bumpy understood stillness. He had spent too many years watching people mistake activity for power. A man could own a car. A man could carry a gun. A man could walk into a room with 5 other men behind him. None of that meant much if nobody knew what he would do when the room went quiet. Bumpy had learned to make the quiet work for him. Harlem knew his face. It knew the slight build, the sharp clothes, the controlled expression, the way he could sit at a table without appearing to pay attention while somehow knowing everything happening around him. He had grown into that discipline. It had not come naturally. The young Ellsworth Johnson had been different. He had grown up poor. His family had moved north from South Carolina when he was still young, hoping Harlem would offer opportunities the South could not. Instead, Harlem offered something more complicated. A city within a city. Music, churches, restaurants, theaters, bookstores, nightclubs, political machines, numbers operators, street gangs, and people who knew how to survive between all of them. Bumpy learned quickly. He dropped out of high school and entered the street economy. At first, that meant small things, then bigger things, then things that carried consequences. He eventually became associated with William "Bub" Hewlett, an important Harlem underworld figure who helped bring him deeper into the numbers racket. That education changed him, not because Hewlett taught him how to be violent, because he taught him how Harlem worked. That was different. Violence was visible. Organization was not. The visible man got the reputation. The invisible man kept the money moving. Bumpy wanted to understand the second one. He watched, he listened, he remembered. 3 words could tell him more than 30. A man's shoes. The people sitting beside him. Ho greeted him. Ho didn't. Ho suddenly stopped talking when he entered. These were details. Bumpy treated them like evidence. And over the years, those details accumulated into something larger. Reputation. Not the kind printed in newspapers. The kind carried from table to table, from bartender to bartender, from apartment building to apartment building, from one neighborhood to another. That kind of reputation couldn't be purchased quickly. It had to be earned, and sometimes feared. Bumpy's relationship with Dutch Schultz became part of that history. Schultz was a powerful Jewish American gangster with ambitions that reached into Harlem. But Bumpy had learned something important about territory. You could enter a neighborhood with money. You could enter with muscle. You could even enter with political connections. But if the people already there refused to accept you, the neighborhood could become expensive very quickly. Bumpy survived those pressures. Then came the relationship that would define his career. Stephanie St. Clair, Madame St. Clair, the queen of the policy rackets. She was already an established power in Harlem when Bumpy was still building his reputation. Their partnership became one of the most important chapters in his rise. The details varied depending on who told the story, but the basic reality was clear. Bumpy understood that Harlem's black criminal economy could not simply be swallowed by outside organizations. It had to negotiate. It had to fight. It had to survive. And Bumpy became very good at surviving. Then the prison years came. Alcatraz, a place designed to remove men from their worlds. For Bumpy, that meant removing him from Harlem, but prison did not erase him. It changed him. He read, he studied, he thought. The stories about Bumpy reading philosophy in prison became part of the mythology around him. But the larger point was more important than the books themselves. He was not interested only in surviving the street. He was interested in understanding people. That distinction mattered. A violent man can frighten someone. A calculating man can frighten an entire room. Bumpy preferred calculation. When he returned to Harlem in 1963, he was older. The neighborhood had changed. The country had changed. He had changed. And waiting for him was another generation. Young men who had grown up hearing his name, men who had never seen the battles that created the reputation, men who knew the legend before they knew the man. One of those men was Frank Lucas, and this is where the stories begin to separate. Lucas later described Bumpy as someone who took him seriously, someone who taught him, someone who showed him how the Harlem underworld operated. In later interviews, Lucas portrayed the relationship as deeply personal. He said Bumpy was like a father to him. That story became powerful because it made sense. The old king, the young apprentice, the lessons passed down. The younger man eventually taking what he had learned and building something even larger. It was almost perfect, almost. Mame Johnson remembered something else. She knew Bumpy better than most people alive. She was his wife. She had watched his career. She had lived through his arrests, his prison years, his return, his final years. And she rejected the idea that Frank Lucas had occupied the central position in Bumpy's life that later stories suggested. According to Mime, Lucas was not living in their home. He was not the constant driver depicted in later versions. He was not the intimate protégé that popular culture eventually imagined. That disagreement is not a footnote. It changes the entire story. Because if Lucas was not Bumpy's apprentice in the dramatic way later accounts suggested, then what exactly did Lucas inherit? The answer may have been something much harder to define: a method, a reputation, a blueprint. Bumpy had already demonstrated that Harlem could be controlled without simply becoming an extension of somebody else's organization. He had shown the importance of local relationships. He had shown the importance of patience. And he had shown that the person controlling a network did not have to be the loudest man in the neighborhood. Frank Lucas was younger. He belonged to a different moment. The city was moving faster. The drug trade was changing. The old policy racket world was fading. Heroin was becoming more profitable. The federal government was becoming more aggressive. the stakes were higher, the money was larger, and the men willing to take risks were younger. Bumpy could see the change. He had lived long enough to see several versions of Harlem rise and fall. That was one reason he was dangerous. He knew that every empire eventually changed hands. He had no illusions about permanence. But there was another quality people often remembered: generosity. Bumpy had a reputation for helping Harlem residents. At Christmas, he gave toys to children. He helped people facing eviction. He gave money to people who needed it. Some of those stories became part of his legend because they complicated the image of the gangster. But perhaps they also revealed something essential about how he understood power. A neighborhood was not simply territory. It was people. And if people remembered you when you were gone, you had accomplished something that money could not buy. That was Bumpy's real strength: memory. He had become part of Harlem's memory while he was still alive. That made him different from younger men who wanted to become famous. Bumpy did not have to chase attention. Attention came to him. The newspapers wrote about him. Police investigated him. Politicians knew his name. Gangsters knew his name. And ordinary Harlem residents knew his name too. That was a dangerous combination. It meant Bumpy's reputation existed on several levels at once. To law enforcement, he was a criminal suspect and organized crime figure. To other gangsters, he was a man who had survived. To some Harlem residents, he was a benefactor. To younger men, he was an example. And to people who wanted a story, he was something even more valuable: a legend. But legends have a problem. They attract people who want to stand inside them. Frank Lucas would eventually do exactly that. Whether he was exaggerating the closeness of the relationship or simply remembering it differently, his story placed him near Bumpy Johnson, near the old king, close enough to claim lessons, close enough to claim influence, close enough to make the later story believable, and perhaps that was all a legend needed. Not complete truth, just enough truth to survive. There was another reason Bumpy mattered to Lucas. Bumpy had already answered a question Lucas was still trying to solve. How do you build power in Harlem without depending entirely on the people who already control New York? Bumpy had spent decades answering that question. Lucas was watching a different market, but the principle remained: now your people, now your territory, now your suppliers, now your enemies, and most importantly, know when the rules have changed. Bumpy understood that last lesson better than almost anyone. He had watched one generation replace another. He had watched politicians rise. He had watched gangsters fall. He had watched prison take men away and return them as strangers. He had watched Harlem itself change. So when a younger man looked at him and saw an aging gangster, Bumpy may have seen something else. A man who had already survived the future once. That was the difference between age and experience. Age tells you how long someone has been alive. Experience tells you how many versions of the world they have already survived. Bumpy had survived Prohibition-era Harlem. He had survived the policy wars. He had survived Dutch Schultz. He had survived prison. He had survived Alcatraz. He had survived the federal government coming after him. And when he returned to Harlem in 1963, he was still Bumpy Johnson. That fact alone said something. He was older, but he was not irrelevant. He was quieter, but he was not powerless, and he certainly wasn't finished. The younger men would have their moment. Frank Lucas would have his. But the question was never whether Lucas could become powerful. The question was whether he understood the difference between building an empire and inheriting a legend, because those were two very different things. An empire can be measured: money, territory, connections. People A legend cannot. A legend lives inside other people's memories, and Bumpy Johnson had spent decades putting himself there. That was the man Frank Lucas was standing beside, not a relic, not simply an old gangster. A man who understood that power could become invisible without disappearing. And by the time Harlem began whispering about the younger generation, Bumpy was already watching from the other side of the room. He knew something the younger men did not. The street always makes the same promise. It tells young men they are different, that they are smarter, faster, more ambitious, that the old rules no longer apply. Then time passes, and the young men become the old men. Bumpy had seen that cycle before. He knew exactly where it ended, but Frank Lucas was about to test the cycle himself. And this time, the old king would not be watching from a distance. He would be watching from inside the changing world. Microhook. The young man wanted the future. Bumpy already knew what the future cost. And Harlem was about to find out which one of them understood the city better. Harlem had a way of telling you when the rules were changing. The storefronts looked the same. The apartment buildings stood where they had always stood. The same churches opened their doors. The same restaurants stayed open late. But underneath it, the city was moving, and Bumpy Johnson could feel it. He had spent too many years in Harlem not to. By the middle of the 1960s, the old numbers world that had helped make Bumpy powerful was no longer the whole story. The neighborhood was changing politically, socially, and economically. The civil rights movement had changed the language of power. Younger black men were looking at the old generation differently, and the drug trade was becoming more important, more profitable, and more dangerous. Bumpy had returned from more than a decade behind bars in 1963. He had returned to a city that had continued without him. That alone was a warning. A man can leave Harlem for a year and come back to find a few new faces. Leave for 11 years, and you come back to a different city. Bumpy knew that. He didn't expect Harlem to have waited, but there was something he did expect. Respect. That was still there. The old relationships had not completely vanished. The old names still opened doors. But respect and control were not the same thing. That distinction would become critical, because while Bumpy was trying to understand the new Harlem, Frank Lucas was studying the same city from a different position. Younger, hungrier, less attached to the old rules, and increasingly interested in a business that had transformed the streets. Heroin. Lucas had already spent years around crime, before becoming the figure history remembers. He had grown up in North Carolina. He came to New York as a young man. He hustled, he learned, he watched. And eventually, according to his own account, Bumpy Johnson became one of the most important people in his education. But there is an important problem with that version. The relationship itself is disputed. Lucas said Bumpy took him under his wing and eventually made him a trusted associate. Mame Johnson said something very different. She remembered Lucas as someone who was around Bumpy occasionally, but not the intimate right-hand man later stories would suggest. She specifically disputed Lucas's claim that he had been Bumpy's driver for 15 years. Her explanation was blunt. Bumpy drove himself. Lucas may have driven him a few times, but 15 years? No, that could not fit the timeline. Bumpy spent years in prison, and that contradiction creates the first crack in the legend, because if Frank Lucas wasn't beside Bumpy for 15 years, then the question becomes more uncomfortable. How much of Lucas's later success actually came from Bumpy, and how much came from Lucas himself? There was no simple answer, and Harlem did not care about simple answers. Harlem cared about results. Money, protection, loyalty, who could deliver, who could survive, who could keep people alive, who could keep people paid, and who could keep the police from destroying everything. Bumpy understood those calculations. Frank Lucas understood them too. But Lucas was beginning to see something Bumpy's generation had never possessed in quite the same way. Scale. The old Harlem rackets were local. Lucas wanted something larger. He wanted to bypass the middlemen. He wanted direct access to supply. He wanted control from the source to the street. And according to his later account, that meant looking far beyond Harlem, far beyond New York, all the way to Southeast Asia. That ambition was different. It wasn't simply about controlling a few corners. It was about controlling the pipeline, and that changed the stakes completely. Bumpy had built influence through relationships. Lucas wanted leverage through supply. The distinction sounds technical. It wasn't. It was the difference between knowing who controlled the neighborhood and controlling what entered the neighborhood. One depended on trust. The other depended on logistics. One could be built over decades. The other could expand rapidly if the supply chain worked. And Frank Lucas believed he had found a way to make it work. The story that eventually emerged around him became famous. Direct heroin connections, large quantities, a network extending across the United States, and the famous Blue Magic brand. Some of the details Lucas later told were disputed or challenged, particularly the most dramatic stories surrounding how he transported heroin. But the larger historical fact is not difficult to establish. Lucas became a major Harlem drug trafficker in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and his rise happened during the period when Bumpy's old world was already weakening. That timing matters, because Bumpy did not die in the middle of Lucas's empire. He died before Lucas reached the height of his fame. That made the later story convenient. Bumpy was gone. Lucas was alive. The old man could no longer contradict him, and the younger man could tell the story however he remembered it. That is not an accusation. It is simply what happens when history loses one of its witnesses. Bumpy could not sit across from a reporter and answer every claim. Mame could, and she did. But the most powerful witness was already gone. Bumpy. There was another problem. The movie version came later, much later. When American Gangster arrived in 2007, millions of people encountered Bumpy Johnson through the story of Frank Lucas. On screen, the relationship was clean. Bumpy was the older king. Frank was the younger protégé. Bumpy dies. Frank rises. The old empire passes into new hands. It is excellent drama. But history is rarely excellent drama. It is usually messier. In reality, there is not enough reliable evidence to support every detail of the cinematic relationship. Even biographies that identify Bumpy as Lucas's mentor acknowledge the disagreement over how close they actually were. And that uncertainty matters, because the title of this story depends on a confrontation that may never have happened in the exact words people imagine. Frank Lucas calling Bumpy old news is a powerful, dramatic line, but there is no reliable source establishing it as a verified quotation, so the real confrontation has to be found somewhere else. Not in a sentence, in the changing streets. Bumpy represented one kind of Harlem power. Lucas represented another, and the younger man's ambition was beginning to expose the limits of the older system. That was the threat, not Frank Lucas himself. Chance Bumpy had survived gang wars. He had survived federal investigations. He had survived Alcatraz. He had survived the loss of friends. But you cannot intimidate change. You cannot negotiate with it. You cannot tell it to wait. Change simply arrives. And by the late 1960s, it was arriving faster. The drug trade was expanding. Young dealers were becoming more independent. the Italian mafia, still possessed enormous influence. Police corruption complicated everything, and the federal government was becoming increasingly interested in organized narcotics trafficking. Everybody was watching: the street, the police, the federal government, the mafia, the young dealers, and Bumpy, especially Bumpy. He understood what happened when a system became too rigid. It broke, so he adapted. He tried legitimate businesses. He opened Palmetto Exterminating after his release. He attempted to move some distance away from the street economy that had defined his earlier years. But the past does not disappear because a man changes his business card. The name remains. The relationships remain. The enemies remain. And the younger generation keeps watching. Frank Lucas was watching. The question was what he saw. Did he see an aging gangster? Or did he see the last surviving architect of a system that could no longer contain the kind of operation he wanted to build? Maybe both. Lucas did not need to hate Bumpy to outgrow him. That is the important point. Generational conflict does not always begin with betrayal. Sometimes it begins with ambition. The student looks at the teacher and thinks, I can do this bigger, faster, more efficiently, with fewer restrictions. That is how the old system becomes old. Not because it suddenly stops working, because someone discovers a new way around it. And Lucas was searching for exactly that. Bumpy's strength had been Harlem. Lucas wanted something that could reach beyond Harlem. The difference was geographic. But geography determines power. If you control one neighborhood, you have territory. If you control a supply chain, you have leverage. Lucas understood the second possibility, and that made him dangerous. Not necessarily to Bumpy personally, to the entire structure Bumpy represented. There is another detail that makes the story even more complicated. Lucas later claimed Bumpy had protected him when he had multiple contracts out on his life. In a later interview, Lucas described Bumpy as someone who had his back when serious threats were hanging over him. If that account is true, then Bumpy was not simply an obstacle, he was protection. And that creates a strange relationship between the old power and the new. The younger man may have needed the older man's reputation, while simultaneously wanting to surpass the older man's limitations. That happens in every generation. But in Harlem, the consequences were more severe. There was no room for sentimental succession. If you misread the balance of power, you could lose everything: money, freedom, sometimes your life. Bumpy knew that. Lucas knew it too. The difference was that Lucas was willing to gamble more. And the biggest gamble was heroin. The profits could be enormous, so could the consequences. Bumpy's generation had understood the value of controlling a neighborhood. Luke's generation was beginning to understand the value of controlling the product itself. That was the pressure building beneath Harlem, and Bumpy was standing directly over it. The old king could see the younger men coming. But seeing them coming was not the same as stopping them. There was no single meeting where Bumpy handed over Harlem. No documented ceremony, no chair, no crown, no official successor. The real transition was quieter. A business changed. A relationship shifted. A younger man gained customers. An older man lost influence. A police investigation opened. A shipment arrived. Someone disappeared from the neighborhood. Someone else suddenly had money. That is how criminal empires actually change hands. Not with trumpets. With small changes nobody notices until the old order is already gone. Bumpy understood that better than anyone. He had watched Harlem change before. He had survived enough history to know that no empire belonged to its owner forever. But perhaps he underestimated one thing: how quickly the next generation could move. Frank Lucas wasn't trying to become Bumpy Johnson. He was trying to become Frank Lucas. That distinction is what makes the story dangerous, because if Lucas had simply copied Bumpy, he might have remained a subordinate. Instead, he looked at the old blueprint and started drawing his own. The supply routes would be different. The scale would be different. The money would be different. The risk would be different. And eventually, the legend would be different too. Bumpy had built his reputation over decades. Lucas would build his much faster. Then came 1968, the year everything changed. Bumpy was 62. Lucas was 37. The age difference was 25 years. One man had spent most of his life building a reputation. The other was entering the years when that reputation could become an obstacle. And on July 7, Bumpy sat down at Wells' restaurant. He had no idea that the clock was almost out, or perhaps he did. Perhaps an old man who had survived as long as Bumpy had learned not to assume there would always be another morning. The restaurant was ordinary. That was the strange part. No gunfire, no ambush, no rival gang, no dramatic confrontation, just dinner. Then his heart failed, and the man who had once seemed impossible to remove from Harlem was suddenly gone. The younger generation was still there. Frank Lucas was still there. The streets were still there. The money was still there. And the question Bumpy's death left behind was almost cruel in its simplicity. Who had really been waiting for him to disappear? Because if Frank Lucas had truly been nothing more than Bumpy's student, then Bumpy's death should have created a successor. But if Lucas had been something else, a younger observer, a distant associate, a man who learned from Bumpy without belonging to him, then Bumpy's death meant something completely different. It meant the old system had ended, and Frank Lucas was about to build something new on top of its ruins. That was the threat. Not that Frank Lucas was stronger. Not that Bumpy was weaker. The threat was that the world had changed enough for strength itself to mean something different. Bumpy had mastered Harlem. Lucas was preparing to master the supply. And when those two ideas collided, the old king did not need to lose a fight. Time was already doing the fighting for him. Micro Hook Bumpy still had the name. Lucas was beginning to have the future, and Harlem was about to discover which one was worth more. But there was one thing neither man could control: the clock. The story gets easier if you believe one man replaced another, Bumpy Johnson. Then Frank Lucas, old king, new king, one chair, two men. History loves that kind of symmetry. But Harlem did not work that way. There was no chair, no ceremony, no night when Bumpy called Frank into a back room, placed his hands on the table, and said, "It's yours now." Power did not transfer that cleanly. It leaked. It shifted. It moved through relationships, through money, through fear, through memory, and sometimes through a name. That was the deeper truth about Bumpy Johnson. His greatest possession was not a particular street. It was the knowledge of how Harlem connected. Bumpy understood that the neighborhood was an ecosystem. Numbers operators needed customers. Customers needed money. Businesses needed protection. Politicians needed votes. Police officers needed information. Gangsters needed introductions. Families needed help. Everyone needed something. And Bumpy understood the connections between those needs. That was why his influence could survive years in prison. The man could leave. The network remained. That distinction is easy to miss when looking backward. People often imagine organized crime as territory, a map, a few blocks shaded in, one gang here, another gang there. But the most important territory was invisible: trust. Bumpy had spent decades building it, and trust is difficult to measure. You cannot put it in a bank account. You cannot count it in kilograms. You cannot photograph it. You only notice it when someone needs something. A phone call gets answered. A door opens. A warning arrives before the police. A debt gets forgiven. A rival suddenly decides not to continue. That was Bumpy's world. And Frank Lucas entered it at a time when that world was changing. The younger man saw the same streets, but he saw different possibilities. That is where the myth becomes useful, because when Lucas later talked about Bumpy, he did not describe him simply as an older criminal. He described a teacher, a man who had shown him the rules, a man who had protected him, a man who had helped shape his thinking. Mame Johnson challenged that version. She did not deny that Lucas knew Bumpy. She denied that he occupied the place in Bumpy's life that later stories gave him. That distinction matters, because both versions can contain a piece of truth. Lucas could have learned from Bumpy without being his constant companion. He could have respected him without being his closest lieutenant. He could have received advice without being formally trained, and Bumpy could have influenced Lucas without ever realizing how large that influence would become. Sometimes a mentor does not know he is a mentor. Sometimes the student is watching from across the room. Sometimes the lesson is not spoken, it is simply observed. A man enters a restaurant. Everyone becomes quieter. He says almost nothing. The room adjusts. That is a lesson. A young man watches a businessman pay protection money. Another man refuses. One stays open. The other doesn't. That is a lesson too. Bumpy's generation understood these lessons instinctively. Lucas belonged to a generation that wanted to turn them into systems. That was the difference. Bumpy knew the street. Lucas wanted to industrialize it. The distinction would become enormous. By the time Lucas became deeply involved in heroin trafficking, the business was no longer simply about knowing which corner belonged to whom. It was about supply, distribution, transportation, connections beyond Harlem. The scale changed. And when the scale changes, the old rules become less useful. A local operator can know everyone in a neighborhood, but he cannot personally know everyone involved in an international supply chain. He needs intermediaries. He needs systems. He needs money moving through multiple hands. He needs secrecy. He needs logistic. Frank Lucas understood that, or at least he believed he did, and that belief pushed him toward a model of criminal enterprise very different from the world. Bumpy had mastered, but there was something Bumpy understood that Lucas could never completely escape. The street remembers. You can build a new system. You can make more money. You can move more product. You can create a new name. But the people around you remember who came before. And in Harlem, history was not abstract. History lived upstairs. It worked behind the counter. It sat at the bar. It went to church. It walked down the same sidewalks. The older residents remembered Bumpy. They remembered Madame St. Clair. They remembered the numbers. They remembered the old fights. They remembered which men had been around before the younger generation discovered heroin. That memory gave Bumpy something no shipment could provide. Legitimacy of a strange kind. Not legal legitimacy, social recognition. He belonged to Harlem's history. Frank Lucas was still becoming part of it. That difference explains why Bumpy's name could remain powerful even after his criminal influence had declined. He was no longer simply an operator. He had become a reference point. When people described Harlem's underworld, they mentioned Bumpy. When people described Frank Lucas, they eventually mentioned Bumpy too. That is the irony. Lucas's legend helped preserve Bumpy's, and Bumpy's legend helped explain Lucas's. The two stories became attached. One could not be fully told without the other. Then came Hollywood. And Hollywood did what Hollywood always does. It simplified. The movie American Gangster turned a complicated historical relationship into a dramatic father and son narrative. Denzel Washington played Frank Lucas, Chiwetel Ejiofor played Huey Lucas, and Clarence Williams III played Bumpy Johnson. The movie was compelling. But compelling is not the same thing as documentary. Mame Johnson criticized the film's portrayal of her husband and rejected major elements of its depiction of Lucas's relationship with Bumpy. Historyofshollywood.com. That matters because once a movie becomes popular, the fictional version can become stronger than the historical record. People remember scenes they never witnessed. They remember dialogue nobody can verify. They remember relationships as the movie arranged them. And eventually those memories become history. That is how legends harden. But the real story has sharper edges. Bumpy had spent much of his life operating inside a black Harlem power structure that had existed long before Lucas. He had dealt with white organized crime. He had negotiated. He had fought. He had gone to prison. He had returned. He had tried legitimate business. He had become a community figure as well as a criminal figure. Lucas arrived later. He was not entering an empty landscape. He was entering a city already shaped by men like Bumpy. That does not diminish Lucas. It explains him. Every generation of power is built on the ruins of the previous generation. The younger man rarely starts from zero. He inherits roads, contacts, marquettes, lessons, warnings, and mistakes. That is what Bumpy left behind. Not necessarily an empire that Frank Lucas simply took over, a set of conditions, a knowledge base. A reputation that made the younger generations easier to understand, and there was one lesson above all others. Never confuse visibility with power. Bumpy was famous, but he did not behave like a man chasing fame. Lucas became famous too, but the scale of his later legend was different. It reached beyond Harlem, beyond New York, beyond organized crime circles. It reached movies, books, television, popular culture. Bumpy never had that kind of national celebrity while alive, yet in another sense, he had something Lucas could not manufacture. He had been there first. He had been part of Harlem's memory before anybody was filming it. That gave him historical weight. And historical weight is difficult to defeat. You can out-earn a man. You can outgrow him. You can become more famous. But you cannot erase the fact that he existed before you. Frank Lucas could build an empire. He could not rebuild the Harlem that had created Bumpy. That Harlem was already gone, and this is where the title becomes more complicated. If Frank Lucas ever regarded Bumpy as old news, the statement would reveal more about Lucas's generation than about Bumpy himself, because Bumpy's age did not make his lessons irrelevant. It made them dangerous. Old men remember consequences. Young men remember opportunities. Those two perspectives rarely agree. The young man sees the money. The old man sees the prison sentence. The young man sees the root. The old man sees who controls it. The young man sees a rival. The old man sees a pattern. Bumpy had seen patterns for decades. He had watched men become powerful. He had watched them become careless. He had watched them disappear into prison. He had watched others take their places. That was the deeper truth. Bumpy did not need to defeat Frank Lucas to prove his relevance. He only needed to have understood the world Lucas was entering. And he did. The tragedy was that Bumpy did not live long enough to see the full consequences. He died in July 1968. Frank Lucas's most famous years were still ahead. The older man's story ended before the younger man's legend reached its peak. That timing created the illusion of succession. Bumpy dies. Lucas rises. Therefore, Lucas replaced Bumpy. But history does not prove that. What it proves is that their lives overlapped during a period of enormous change. The exact depth of their relationship remains disputed. Their influence on each other is harder to measure. And the idea that Bumpy simply handed Harlem to Lucas is unsupported by the historical record. The real transition was much messier. Bumpy's world was declining. Lucas's world was expanding. Between them was a city changing faster than either man could completely control. And perhaps that is why their story survived. Because it isn't really about two gangsters. It is about inheritance. What does one generation leave for the next? Money, territory, enemies, or knowledge? Bumpy left all four. But the most valuable inheritance was invisible. He left a warning. Harlem could make you powerful. Harlem could also make you believe you were more powerful than you really were. Every ambitious man eventually faced that choice. Slow down, watch, listen, or move faster. Take bigger risks. Believe the old rules no longer apply. Frank Lucas chose speed. Bumpy had learned patience. Neither choice guaranteed survival. But only one of them had already lived through the consequences of the previous generation's mistakes. And by 1968, Bumpy's body was failing. His world was shrinking. The younger men were moving faster. The city was changing. The federal government was closing in. Yet his name still carried weight. That was the contradiction. The old king was losing the ability to control the future. But the future was still being built on the lessons of the past. Then came the night at Wells' restaurant. A plate of food, a cup of coffee, a table, a heart that suddenly stopped. And after that moment, there would be no chance for Bumpy to correct the stories told about him. No interview. No argument. No final explanation. Only the people who remembered, and the people who wanted to remember differently. Frank Lucas would become one of those storytellers. Mame Johnson would become another. Between them stood a dead man who could no longer speak. That silence would become the most valuable piece of the legend, because once Bumpy was gone, everyone else could decide what he had meant. Mentor gangster. King benefactor old news, or something harder to define. A man whose greatest power had never been the amount of money he controlled. It had been the fact that people remembered him. And that was something Frank Lucas could never completely replace. Micro hook. Bumpy's empire could disappear. His reputation could not. And that was about to become very important, because the next generation wasn't simply taking Harlem from the old one. It was taking the old one's lessons and changing what they meant. The first thing pressure does is make a man hurry. Bumpy Johnson had spent most of his life refusing to hurry. He knew what happened when a man made decisions because somebody else was watching. So in 1963, when he came back to Harlem after years in prison, he did not return like a king reclaiming a throne. He returned like a man taking inventory. The neighborhood was still there. But it was not waiting for him. The streets had new faces. The old policy world had changed. Younger men were becoming more independent. The drug trade was expanding. Federal agents were paying closer attention. And Bumpy was 60 years old. That number meant something. Not because 60 made him weak, because 60 made time visible. He had already spent years behind bars. He knew exactly what time could take. Friends, business, health, reputation, freedom. Now he was back in Harlem, and the clock was running again. Bumpy understood the danger, but understanding danger did not make it disappear. His return also created another problem. People expected the old Bumpy, the man from the stories, the man who had survived Dutch Schultz, the man associated with Stephanie St. Clair and Harlem's policy operations, the man who had spent years building a reputation that could make strangers lower their voices. But the Bumpy who returned in 1963 was older. He had been through Alcatraz. He had been away while Harlem changed, and he could not simply walk backward into the past. So he adapted. He tried legitimate work. Palmetto exterminating became part of his post-prison life. It was not glamorous. That was the point. A business card looked different from a criminal indictment. A paycheck looked different from money passed, hand to hand. A storefront looked different from a backroom meeting. Bumpy appeared to understand that the safest future might be one in which his name stopped making headlines. But the street had other plans. It is difficult to become ordinary after spending decades becoming extraordinary. People still knew him. People still came to him. People still remembered. And memory creates pressure. A man can walk away from an old life. An old life does not always walk away from him. That was the world Frank Lucas was entering at the same time. Lucas was not 60. He was in his 30s. He had energy Bumpy no longer possessed. He had fewer years invested in the old order, and he was looking at the drug trade with a different eye. Heroin was not simply another criminal market. It was becoming an enormous business. The margins were high. The demand was steady. And the men controlling the supply could make money on a scale that the old neighborhood rackets could not easily match. Lucas wanted to understand the supply itself. That was the pressure building. Bumpy's generation had learned to control people. Lucas wanted to control movement. The difference was subtle at first. Then it became enormous. A man who controls a street depends on the street. A man who controls the source can make the street come to him. That was the theory. And theories become dangerous when money starts proving them right. Lucas later became famous for claiming that he developed direct connections to Southeast Asian heroin suppliers. Some of his most dramatic stories about transportation and military aircraft have been disputed, and later accounts have challenged portions of his mythology. But the broader point remains. He was searching for a way to remove middlemen. That was his advantage, or what he believed was his advantage, because every time a man removes a middleman, he also removes a layer of protection. More control means more responsibility. More money means more attention. More supply means more exposure. And by the late 1960s, attention was exactly what Bumpy did not need. Federal authorities were already pursuing him. He was arrested in 1965 on narcotics-related charges. Later, he faced another federal indictment connected to heroin conspiracy. The old king was no longer simply dealing with street rivals. He was dealing with a government that had more time, more files, more agents, and more resources than any Harlem crew could match. That changed the nature of pressure. A rival could be negotiated with. A government investigation could follow you for years. Bumpy knew that. He had been through prison before. He knew what federal power looked like from the inside, and now it was approaching again. 3 years before his death, Bumpy was arrested on drug charges and released on bail. The message was clear. The government was not forgetting him. Neither was the street, and neither were the younger men. That was the part that made the pressure personal. Bumpy could not simply disappear. Too many people knew his name. Too many people had expectations. Too many people wanted something from him. And one of those people was Frank Lucas. Or at least that is how Lucas later described it. According to Lucas, Bumpy remained an important figure in his life. According to Mamie Johnson, the relationship was much less intimate. The contradiction remained. But perhaps there was a reason both versions survived. Lucas did not need Bumpy to be his constant mentor for Bumpy to matter. He only needed to have seen enough to understand how Bumpy behaved. enough to understand how people responded to him, enough to understand what mistakes to avoid. Sometimes one meeting teaches more than a year of friendship. Sometimes a young man learns more by watching an older man's downfall than by listening to his advice. And Bumpy was beginning to demonstrate the cost of being visible. The newspapers knew his name. The police knew his name. Federal prosecutors knew his name. The public knew his name. That kind of fame is useful until it isn't. Lucas was learning the opposite lesson. Stay behind the operation. Let other people carry the visible risk. Keep the money moving. Keep the supply moving. Keep yourself difficult to reach. That was the emerging philosophy, and it was radically different from Bumpy's old world reputation. Bumpy's power depended partly on being known. Lucas' power depended on controlling what people knew. The two approaches could coexist for a while, but Harlem was becoming too crowded with ambition. Young dealers wanted independence. Established organizations wanted their share. Federal agents wanted arrests, and the narcotics market wanted more product. Every pressure fed another pressure. Then there was Harlem itself. The neighborhood was experiencing political and social upheaval. The old relationship between community, police, politicians, and organized crime was becoming harder to maintain. People were challenging authority in the streets. Civil rights activism had transformed expectations. Young black men were less willing to accept the old arrangements simply because older men had survived them. Bumpy's generation had learned how to negotiate with power. The younger generation increasingly wanted to challenge it. That distinction mattered. Bumpy had built survival into an art. Lucas was interested in expansion. Expansion creates exposure. Every new customer becomes another possible witness. Every new shipment becomes another possible seizure. Every new associate becomes another possible informant. Every dollar becomes another reason for someone to look closer. The empire grows, so does the target. Bumpy understood that equation. He had lived it. Frank Lucas was willing to test it. That was why the younger man's rise created pressure, even without an open war between the two men. There did not need to be one. Generational competition can happen without a single confrontation. It happens when one man stops asking permission. It happens when customers begin following someone else. It happens when younger men stop using the old networks. It happens when a name that once opened every door becomes only one name among many. Bumpy's greatest fear may not have been Frank Lucas. It may have been irrelevance. Because irrelevance is different from defeat. Defeat is visible. Someone beats you. Someone takes your territory. Someone wins. Irrelevance is quieter. People simply stop calling. That is harder to fight. Bumpy had spent decades making sure people remembered him. Now he had to live in a city where people were starting to remember someone else. But there was still one thing the younger men could not manufacture: Bumpy's history. He had already survived too much. He had already become part of Harlem's identity, and that gave him a kind of protection. Not legal protection, not physical protection, cultural protection. People knew what his name meant. That made replacing him more complicated than replacing a dealer. You could take a corner. You could take customers. You could take money. But you could not take 30 years of memory. Frank Lucas could build a larger operation. He could become richer. He could become more famous. But he could not become the Bumpy Johnson who had existed before him. That was impossible. The pressure continued anyway. Bumpy's health was not what it had been. His legal troubles were growing. His old world was changing. His younger contemporaries were disappearing, and the younger generation was accelerating. He had survived the first half of the century. But the second half was asking different questions. Could an old king adapt? Could he become legitimate? Could he remain relevant without returning completely to the street? Could he protect the people who still depended on him? Could he survive the government? Could he survive his own body? There were too many questions, and Bumpy had fewer years left to answer them. Frank Lucas, meanwhile, had time. That was his greatest advantage: time to experiment, time to build, time to make mistakes, time to become something Bumpy no longer had enough years to become. This was not a fair contest. It wasn't supposed to be. History rarely gives two generations the same starting line. Bumpy had already spent his youth fighting yesterday's wars. Lucas was preparing for tomorrow's. That was the real pressure, not hatred, not a dramatic rivalry. Timing. One man was reaching the end of a long story. The other was approaching the beginning of his most important chapter. And then Bumpy's legal situation tightened. Federal prosecutors had already established that they were willing to pursue him. He was no longer operating in an environment where local reputation alone could keep trouble away. The government could wait. Bumpy could not. His body could not. The neighborhood could not. Everything was becoming urgent. Yet Bumpy still moved with the same patience. That was what people remembered. He did not become frantic simply because the world around him was. He kept his routines. He kept his relationships. He kept showing up. That calm could be mistaken for confidence. Maybe it was. Maybe it was simply experience. A man who has already spent years in prison has a different relationship with fear. He knows what the worst room looks like. He has already slept there. He has already heard the doors lock. So a federal indictment does not carry the same shock it carries for a man who has never lost his freedom. Bumpy had lost his freedom, and he had gotten it back. That was why his presence still mattered. He was proof that survival was possible, but survival had a limit. On July 7, 1968, Bumpy went to Wells' restaurant. He was not walking into a courtroom. He was not walking into a gang meeting. He was not walking into an ambush. He was going to eat. And that is what makes the ending of his life so unsettling. After everything he had survived, the thing that stopped him was not a rival, not a gun, not a prison cell. His heart. The pressure had been building for years. The legal pressure, the street pressure, the pressure of age, the pressure of a changing city, the pressure of watching a new generation move faster than his. Then, in the middle of an ordinary meal, the pressure became physical. He suffered a heart attack, and the old man's story ended. But the younger man's was just beginning to accelerate. Frank Lucas would soon become associated with a drug empire that would make his name nationally famous. Bumpy would become the man before him. That sounds like a simple succession. It wasn't, because Bumpy did not die knowing how large Lucas's legend would become. He did not know what stories would later be told. He did not know Hollywood would turn their relationship into one of the most famous gangster narratives of the era. He did not know his widow would spend years correcting those stories. He did not know people would argue over how close he and Lucas really were. He died before the argument became famous. That may have been the cruelest part. The man who understood reputation better than almost anyone was no longer alive to control his own. And now the younger generation had the microphone. Micro hook. Bumpy had spent his life controlling what people said about him. Death took that control away. But the next chapter would show what happened when the pressure finally stopped, being something Bumpy could manage, and became something nobody could negotiate with. The night at Wells' restaurant was coming, and this time there would be no way back. July 7, 1968. Harlem was warm that night, the kind of summer night when the heat stayed trapped between apartment buildings and the pavement seemed to hold the day's temperature long after sunset. Cars moved slowly along 7th Avenue. Storefronts were still lit. People were eating late. Music came through open windows. Nothing about the night announced an ending. At Wells' restaurant, Bumpy Johnson sat down for a meal. He was 62 years old. His life had already contained several lifetimes: Charleston, Harlem, the numbers, Madame St. Clair, Dutch Schultz prison, Alcatraz, the return, the federal government, the younger generation, and now this, a restaurant, a table, food in front of him. The ordinary details are important because Bumpy's death was not the kind of ending people expected from a man like him. There was no gunshot, no ambush, no rival waiting outside, no final confrontation. His heart simply failed. The man who had survived the streets was defeated by something the streets could not negotiate with: his own body. That was the breaking point. But to understand why that night mattered, you have to understand what Bumpy had been carrying into it. He had spent years learning how to live under pressure. Pressure was not new to him. Prison was pressure. Federal surveillance was pressure. Rivals were pressure. Money was pressure. Loyalty was pressure. Even reputation was pressure. A man becomes famous for being dangerous, then discovers that everybody expects him to remain dangerous forever. That is its own kind of prison. Bumpy had returned to Harlem in 1963 after serving years behind bars. He was older. He had tried to establish a legitimate business. He had tried to live with the fact that his most famous years were behind him, but the city did not completely release him. His name remained attached to the underworld, and the federal government remained interested. In 1965, Bumpy was arrested on narcotics charges. Later, he faced another federal case involving heroin conspiracy. The legal pressure was no longer something distant. It was around him. The government was building cases. The streets were changing, and Bumpy's body was aging. 3 different clocks were running: the law's clock, the street's clock, his own biological clock. None of them cared about his reputation. That was the strange thing about age. A young gangster can believe reputation protects him from everything. An older gangster knows better. Bumpy had seen men who once seemed untouchable end up behind bars. He had seen others die. He had seen powerful organizations change leaders. He understood that nobody remained king forever. The question was how the transition would happen. Frank Lucas was already part of the answer. Not because there is evidence that Bumpy formally handed him anything. There isn't. Not because Lucas can be documented as Bumpy's unquestioned successor. He cannot. The historical record is far more complicated. But Lucas was becoming part of a new Harlem, and that new Harlem was operating on different economics. Heroin had become central. The profits were enormous. The supply routes stretched far beyond neighborhood boundaries, and younger operators were willing to take risks that older men had learned to avoid. Lucas was one of them. He later claimed Bumpy had taught him. Mame Johnson disputed how close they had been. Those two accounts cannot simply be blended into one convenient truth. They have to remain separate. Lucas's memory, Mame's memory, the historical evidence between them. And somewhere in that gap is the real relationship. Perhaps Bumpy gave advice. Perhaps Lucas observed him. Perhaps Lucas exaggerated the intimacy later. Perhaps Mame remembered only the part she saw, but none of those possibilities changes the larger fact. Lucas was watching the old world, and he wanted to build the new one. That was what made the generational shift so powerful. Bumpy did not need to fight Lucas for Lucas to become his successor in the public imagination. All Lucas needed was time. Bumpy had very little left. The night at Wells' restaurant was therefore more than a death. It was a cutoff point. Before that night, Bumpy could still answer questions. After that night, he couldn't. That distinction would matter enormously, because legends grow fastest around people who cannot correct them. A living man can say, "That's not what happened." A dead man cannot. Bumpy's death created silence, and silence is fertile ground for mythology. But before the mythology came the room, the restaurant, the people around him, the meal. Bumpy had been known to enjoy food. He was not sitting in a fortified compound. He was not hiding. He was living in Harlem, his Harlem, the place where he had spent most of his adult life. Even after prison, even after federal charges, even after the city had changed, he still belonged there. That may have been one of the most revealing things about him. He could have left. He didn't. He could have disappeared into another city. He didn't. He remained connected to Harlem. And Harlem remained connected to him. Then his body gave the warning. Something was wrong. He suffered a heart attack. The room changed. The man who had spent decades making other people react was suddenly the one everyone was reacting to. People moved. Someone called for help. The restaurant became a different place. The old rules disappeared. Nobody cared about reputation. Nobody cared about territory. Nobody cared who knew whom. There was only a man on the floor. And time. Skins. Minutes, the kind of time Bumpy had spent his whole life trying to control. Now he could not. That was the breaking point. Not a rival, not Frank Lucas, not the federal government. Time itself. Bumpy died shortly before 2 a.m. The news spread quickly. Harlem woke up to the death of a man who had been part of its underworld for more than 3 decades. The strange thing was what happened next. The city did not simply move on. People came. Thousands attended his funeral. Some came because they remembered the gangster. Some came because they remembered the man who helped people. Some came because they remembered his wife. Some came because they had grown up hearing his name. And some came simply because Bumpy Johnson belonged to Harlem's history. That funeral revealed something his criminal record never could. His influence was not measured only by money. If it had been, his death would have been a business event. Instead, it became a community event. That contradiction followed Bumpy even after death. Criminal, benefactor, gangster, neighborhood figure, myth, all of those descriptions existed at the same time. And the younger generation was now free to write its own chapter. Frank Lucas was still alive. Bumpy was not. That imbalance mattered. Lucas could tell stories. Bumpy could not. Lucas could explain his relationship with Bumpy. Bumpy could not answer. Lucas could describe what he had learned. Bumpy could not confirm or deny it. And years later, a movie could take those stories and turn them into scenes. That is how the dead lose control of their own biographies. It happens slowly. A story becomes an interview becomes an article becomes a book becomes a screenplay becomes a movie. Then the movie becomes what millions of people remember. By the time that happens, the original man has disappeared beneath the character. Bumpy Johnson became a character. Frank Lucas became a character too, and their relationship became something almost perfectly designed for cinema. Old mentor, young protégé, a final lesson, a successor. But the real story had no clean handoff. There was no evidence of Bumpy sitting Frank Lucas down and declaring him the next king of Harlem. No documented succession ceremony. No clear moment when one empire became another. The transition was economic, generational, cultural. It happened through changing markets and changing people. And the most important thing Bumpy left behind was not an organization. It was an example. He showed what could happen when a black criminal operator built influence inside Harlem while negotiating with larger organized crime structures. Lucas watched that history. Then he chose a different route. He went bigger. He moved more aggressively. He focused on heroin. He sought direct supply. That strategy would eventually make him extraordinarily wealthy. It would also make him a much larger target. The irony was already forming. Bumpy's strategy had been built around relationships. Lucas's strategy was built around scale. Relationships create loyalty. Scale creates visibility. The more Lucas expanded, the more people needed to know about him. The more money moved, the more investigators wanted to know where it came from. The bigger the operation became, the harder it was to keep invisible. And eventually, Lucas would discover the same lesson Bumpy had learned years earlier. The government does not care how powerful your reputation is. It cares whether it can build a case. Bumpy had already been caught in that machine. Lucas would eventually be caught too. But on July 7, 1968, that future was still ahead. For Bumpy, there was only the restaurant, the meal, the pain, the final moments, then silence. He was gone. The old generation had lost one of its most recognizable figures. But Harlem had not lost the memory. That memory would become more important with every passing year, because now the arguments could begin. Who had really known Bumpy? Who had really been close to him? What had he taught Frank Lucas? How much had Lucas learned from him? How much had Lucas built himself? And why did the story of one man become inseparable from the story of the other? Mamie Johnson would spend years answering those questions in her own way. She would challenge stories about her husband. She would challenge the movie. She would challenge the idea that Lucas had occupied such a central place in Bumpy's life. But the most powerful version of the story had already escaped. The version people wanted was simple. Bumpy was the old king, Frank was the young king. Bumpy died, Frank rose. End of story. Except it wasn't the end. It was the moment the story became dangerous, because when Bumpy was alive, his presence complicated Frank Lucas's rise. After Bumpy died, Lucas could become the center of the narrative, and the younger man's story was about to become much bigger. The drug operation, the money, the blue magic name, the alleged connections, the eventual federal investigation, the courtroom, the prison sentence, the informant, the movie. Everything that came later would make Frank Lucas famous. But none of it could change one fact. Bumpy had existed first. And that fact would keep returning. Like a name spoken at the edge of every story. Bumpy Johnson. The man before Frank Lucas. The man who could no longer speak for himself. That was the real breaking point. Not simply that Bumpy died, but that his death transferred control of the story to everyone who remained. And the first person to benefit from that silence would be Frank Lucas. Micro hook. The old king was dead. The younger man had survived him. Now there was no one left to ask what really happened between them. But one woman was still alive, and she had spent years watching the story change. Her name was Mamie Johnson, and she was about to challenge the version of Bumpy Johnson that the world wanted to believe. The funeral was over. The flowers were beginning to wilt. The streets had gone back to their ordinary noise. But Harlem had not forgotten Bumpy Johnson. That was the problem. A dead man cannot compete with a living man in the usual ways. He cannot make a phone call. He cannot collect a debt. He cannot negotiate with a rival. He cannot warn a young man that he is moving too fast. But he can remain inside the memory of everyone who knew him. And in Harlem, memory was a form of power. Frank Lucas understood that. Whether he understood it in exactly those words is impossible to know, but he understood the value of Bumpy's name. Years later, he would tell the world that Bumpy had been more than an acquaintance. He would describe him as a mentor, a father figure, a man who had shown him how to survive. Mame Johnson would challenge that. She would say Lucas had exaggerated the relationship. She would reject the idea that he had been Bumpy's constant companion. She would dispute the image of Lucas as the young man sitting at Bumpy's knee, absorbing every secret of Harlem. 2 stories, one dead man, and an enormous amount of space between them. That was the reckoning, because once Bumpy was gone, the question was no longer whether Frank Lucas could become powerful. He could. The question was what his power meant. Did it represent the end of Bumpy's world? Or did it represent the next stage of it? The answer was both. Lucas did not simply walk into an empty room. He walked into a room shaped by men who had come before him. The policy rackets had created markets. The neighborhood operators had created relationships. Bumpy had shown how Black Harlem could maintain its own criminal power while dealing with larger organizations outside it. Lucas inherited the environment. He did not inherit a throne. That distinction matters. There was no documented moment when Bumpy handed Harlem to Lucas. No signed agreement, no public declaration, no formal succession. What came after Bumpy was not a transfer. It was a vacuum. And vacuums create ambition. Frank Lucas had plenty. He was younger. He was willing to take risks. He was looking at heroin as a national business, rather than simply a neighborhood trade. His ambition reached beyond Harlem. That was what made his rise different. Bumpy had been a Harlem institution. Lucas wanted to become an empire. The distinction became visible in the money. Heroin could generate enormous profits, and Lucas believed the biggest advantage was not selling better. It was buying differently. Go closer to the source. Reduce the middlemen, control the supply, control the distribution, control the price. If you could do that, the neighborhood became only one part of the machine. That was the logic, and for a time it worked. Lucas became associated with a heroin organization that spread beyond Harlem. The name Blue Magic became part of the legend. The money became part of the legend. The clothes became part of the legend. The alleged connections became part of the legend. Soon, Frank Lucas was no longer simply a man operating in Harlem. He was a story. And that was where Bumpy's shadow became unavoidable, because people wanted to know, where did Frank Lucas learn to think this way? The answer became Bumpy. It was elegant. Too elegant. The old king teaches the young king. The young king learns the rules. Then he improves them. The old king dies. The young king takes over. It was the perfect explanation. But reality offered something less satisfying. Frank Lucas had his own intelligence, his own ambition, his own willingness to take risks. And whatever Bumpy had taught him, Lucas transformed those lessons into something different. That matters because credit is not the same as influence. A man can influence you without building you. A mentor can give you one idea that you spend 20 years expanding. A person can change your thinking without becoming the architect of your success. Maybe that was the real relationship. Not father and son, not master and apprentice, something more ordinary and perhaps more believable. An older man, a younger man, a changing city. A few lessons, a lot of observation, and 2 completely different futures. But the reckoning was not only between Bumpy and Lucas. It was between the legend and the record. The legend said Bumpy was the old king and Lucas was the successor. The record was messier. Bumpy had died before Lucas reached the height of his criminal power. Bumpy had not formally handed him an empire. Mame Johnson disputed the depth of their relationship. Lucas later became famous for his own operation, and the federal government eventually brought that operation down. That last part is important, because if Lucas's rise was supposed to prove that the old system was obsolete, his eventual fall demonstrated something Bumpy already understood. No empire is permanent. Money creates exposure. Exposure creates evidence. Evidence creates investigations. And investigations can wait. The government has patience too. Lucas's organization eventually attracted the attention of law enforcement. Detective Richie Roberts became central to the story that would later inspire American Gangster. But even here, the popular version became cleaner than the record. The movie turned Roberts and Lucas into opposing figures. Good guy, bad guy, cop kingpin, another perfect structure. But real investigations are rarely that simple. They are paperwork, surveillance, informants' mistakes, long nights, courtrooms, and people deciding when they have had enough. Lucas eventually faced the same institution that had pursued Bumpy, the federal government. Different decade, different operation, same basic machine. The government did not care that Lucas had a reputation. It cared about evidence. That was Bumpy's final lesson. Whether Lucas ever consciously learned it or not, the street can make you famous. The law can make you ordinary again. A number on a case file, a defendant's name, a prison sentence. That was the reckoning. Lucas had become larger than the world Bumpy knew, but he was still vulnerable to the same force. Time, law, human weakness, betrayal, and eventually his own mythology. The most powerful part of Lucas's story was also the part that became most difficult to separate from exaggeration. He had a real criminal career. He had a real organization. He became a major heroin trafficker. He was convicted. He cooperated with authorities after his arrest. But around those facts grew a larger mythology, stories about his connections, stories about his methods, stories about the scale of his operation. Some were difficult to verify. Some were challenged. Some became famous because they sounded exactly like the kind of thing a gangster legend should contain. And that is how the public imagination works. It rewards the cleanest story. Bumpy's story was clean too clean. A Harlem king, a young protégé, a succession, a drug empire, a federal cop, a fall Hollywood loved it. But the people who lived it remembered the rough edges. Mame Johnson remembered them. She remembered the man behind the legend. She remembered that Bumpy had a life outside the criminal mythology. She remembered his generosity. She remembered his flaws. She remembered his marriage. She remembered the years when he was gone. And she remembered who was actually there. That last part became especially important because Lucas later claimed he was present when Bumpy died. Mame Johnson said he was not. She said Bumpy died with childhood friend Junie Bird. That disagreement seems small. It is not. If Lucas was not even present at Bumpy's death, then the cinematic image of the young protégé standing beside the old king at the final moment collapses, and with it goes the neat succession story. The younger man was not necessarily standing at the old man's deathbed, waiting for the crown. He was elsewhere, building his own future. That is a very different story. It makes Lucas less like an heir, and more like a successor created by circumstance. Bumpy died. Harlem changed. Lucas rose. That does not mean Lucas was waiting for Bumpy to die. It means history moved. Sometimes that is all succession is. One man disappears. Another man is already moving. There is no handoff, no agreement, just timing. And timing can create myths. Years later, the movie would make the relationship feel inevitable. But it was not. The real world is full of accidents. Bumpy's heart attack, Lucas's ambition, Federal investigations, changing drug markets, different memories, all of them collided. And after the collision, people looked backward and tried to create a straight line, Bumpy, then Lucas. But the line was never straight. It was a maze, and Bumpy had spent his life learning how to navigate mazes. That is why calling him old news misses the point. Even if the phrase had been said privately, it would not erase what Bumpy had already accomplished. A younger man can declare an older man irrelevant. That does not make the older man's history irrelevant. In fact, the younger man's success may prove the opposite. Lucas built on a city that Bumpy had helped shape. He entered networks that earlier generations had created. He operated in a Harlem where the name Johnson still meant something. He became famous partly because people wanted to understand the world that had produced him. And the easiest way to explain that world was to put Bumpy at the beginning, the old king, the original, the man before the man. That was Bumpy's strange victory. He did not need to remain alive to remain present. His name survived inside Lucas's story. The younger man could become bigger. He could become richer. He could become nationally famous. But he could not remove the man who came before him. And that is where the title turns on itself. Frank Lucas may have believed the old order was finished. But the old order had already become part of the foundation beneath him. The reckoning was not Bumpy versus Lucas. It was Lucas versus the limits of inheritance. You can inherit knowledge. You can inherit reputation. You can inherit a market. But you cannot inherit another man's life. Lucas had to build his own. And he did. That is why the story should not reduce him to Bumpy's student. It would make Lucas smaller than he was. Frank Lucas was ambitious enough to create his own organization. He was ruthless enough to take enormous risks. He was intelligent enough to understand the weaknesses of the middlemen. And he was reckless enough to believe the system could be controlled. That combination made him powerful. It also made him vulnerable. Bumpy had learned the first half of that lesson decades earlier. Power attracts attention. Attention attracts enemies. Enemies attract law enforcement. And eventually, the empire starts consuming the man who built it. The reckoning was coming for Lucas, too. But first, there was another question. What exactly did Bumpy leave behind? Not a formal organization, not a clean succession, not a documented empire waiting for a new owner. He left Harlem with a memory. And memories are dangerous because everyone owns a different one. To some people, Bumpy was a gangster. To others, he was a protector. To federal prosecutors, he was a criminal defendant. To Mame Johnson, he was her husband. To younger men, he was an example. To Frank Lucas, at least according to Lucas's later account, he was a mentor. And to Hollywood, he became a character. All of those versions could exist. But they were not the same man. That was the final reckoning. The legend had become larger than the evidence. And once that happens, correcting the story becomes almost impossible. Because people don't like complicated legends. They like crowns. They like successors. They like final conversations. They like the old king looking into the eyes of the young king and realizing the future has arrived. But Bumpy never got that scene. There is no reliable record of him telling Frank Lucas that he was finished. There is no verified moment when Bumpy called Lucas old news. There is no documented transfer of Harlem. There is only a city changing around two men who represented different generations. One was nearing the end, one was beginning his rise, and between them stood a truth neither legend could erase. Bumpy Johnson did not need to defeat Frank Lucas. He only needed to survive long enough to become part of the story. Frank Lucas would later tell. He did. Then he died. And the story kept growing. The younger man got the spotlight. The older man got the mythology, but the shadow belonged to Bumpy, Micro Hook. Frank Lucas could build an empire. He could not build the Harlem that came before him, and now that Bumpy was gone, the question was no longer who would replace him. It was what would happen to the man who tried. Because the rise had been impressive, the fall would be even more revealing. And the same city that had watched Bumpy become a legend was about to watch Frank Lucas discover the price of becoming one. The city kept moving. That was the first thing that happened after Bumpy Johnson died. Harlem did not stop. The restaurants opened. The buses ran. The stores unlocked their doors. People went to work. People went home. Children played on sidewalks. Music came through apartment windows. And somewhere inside all that ordinary noise was the absence of one man. Bumpy was gone, but his name was still everywhere. That was the strange part. Death had removed the man. It had not removed the reputation. If anything, it made the reputation stronger. A living gangster can be questioned. A dead gangster becomes a story, and stories travel differently. They get repeated, they get shortened, they get embellished. One person remembers a conversation, another remembers a favor, someone else remembers something they heard from somebody who knew somebody. Eventually, the details blur, the name remains. Bumpy Johnson. That was what Harlem carried forward. Frank Lucas was carrying something too. But his inheritance was different. He had his own ambitions, his own organization, his own money. And now there was no older man standing in the background whose reputation could complicate his rise. Bumpy's death created space. Lucas filled some of it. Not because Bumpy had formally handed it to him. There is no reliable record of such a transfer. He filled it because the city was changing, and he was prepared to move with it. That distinction would become increasingly important. Lucas was not simply Bumpy's replacement. He was the product of a different era. The old Harlem underworld had been built around neighborhood relationships and local rackets. Lucas was building around heroin. The money was larger, the operation was wider, the risks were greater, and the consequences would eventually reach far beyond Harlem. For a while, the story belonged to Lucas. He became one of the most prominent drug traffickers associated with New York's heroin trade. The name Blue Magic became part of his legend. The money became part of his legend. The alleged connections became part of his legend. And eventually, the legend became bigger than the man. That happened to Bumpy too. But Bumpy had one advantage. His widow was still alive. May Johnson had watched the story change. She knew the man behind the name. She knew what Bumpy was like at home. She knew the years he spent away. She knew who came around. She knew who did not. And when stories about Frank Lucas and Bumpy began growing, May challenged them. She rejected the image of Lucas as the intimate protégé portrayed in later versions. She disputed his claim to have been Bumpy's longtime driver. She disputed the idea that he was part of the household in the way the mythology suggested, and she challenged the famous story surrounding Bumpy's final moments. Lucas later claimed he was present when Bumpy died. Mamie said he was not. According to her account, Bumpy died in the arms of his childhood friend Junie Bird. That single disagreement exposed the larger problem. Once Bumpy was dead, everyone else was telling the story. Lucas had his memory. May had hers. The newspapers had theirs. And eventually Hollywood would have another. The story was no longer one story. It was several stories competing for the same dead man. That competition became even more intense decades later. In 2007, American Gangster brought Frank Lucas and Bumpy Johnson to a massive international audience. For millions of viewers, that film became their first introduction to both men. The movie presented Bumpy as an older crime boss whose influence helped shape Lucas. It gave their relationship emotional weight. A young man learns from an aging king. The king dies. The student rises. It was powerful storytelling. But it was not a court transcript. It was not an archival record. It was a movie. And Mame Johnson objected to the portrayal. She believed the film distorted her husband's life and overstated Lucas's connection to him. That created an unusual situation. A movie about Frank Lucas had revived Bumpy Johnson's name, but the woman who knew Bumpy best was publicly saying, "You are remembering the wrong man." That is the aftermath. Not simply what happened after Bumpy died. What happened to the truth after Bumpy died? Because once the witnesses disappear, the legend gets louder. The details that survive are usually the details people enjoy repeating: the dramatic meeting, the secret lesson, the final conversation, the young apprentice, the old king, the inheritance. Those details create a satisfying story. But history does not owe us satisfaction. Sometimes the truth is less cinematic. Maybe Lucas knew Bumpy. Maybe Bumpy advised him. Maybe Lucas remembered those moments as more important than Mamie did. Maybe Mamie saw the relationship from inside the home, while Lucas remembered it from the street. Those perspectives can produce completely different memories without either person necessarily inventing everything. That is why the safest conclusion is also the least dramatic. Their relationship existed. Its exact depth remains disputed, and Frank Lucas built much of his later criminal reputation through his own actions. That is enough. We do not need to turn Bumpy into Lucas's puppet master, and we do not need to erase Bumpy to make Lucas impressive. Both men were significant, but they were significant in different ways. Bumpy belonged to the first half of the story. Lucas belonged to the next. Bumpy represented a Harlem where power depended heavily on knowing the neighborhood. Lucas represented a Harlem where power increasingly depended on controlling the supply chain. Bumpy's reputation was built over decades. Lucas's grew rapidly. Bumpy's name became local history. Lucas's name became national mythology. And then came the final irony. The more famous Lucas became, the more famous Bumpy became again. Every story about Lucas eventually led backward. Who taught him? Who was before him? What was Harlem like before Lucas? Who controlled it? The answer kept returning: Bumpy Johnson. The man who was supposedly finished. The man who was supposedly old news. The man whose name kept surviving. That was not the legacy of a forgotten gangster. That was the legacy of someone who had become part of the city's historical vocabulary. Bumpy did not need a drug empire in the 1970s to remain relevant. He had already become something harder to replace. A reference point. People could argue about Lucas. They could argue about the size of his operation. They could argue about his stories. They could argue about the movie. But when they wanted to explain the Harlem Lucas entered, they kept going back to Bumpy. The old king remained in the background, not controlling the streets, not collecting money, not giving orders, just existing in memory. And sometimes that is more powerful than control. Because control ends when the man dies, memory can continue for generations. There was another aftermath that mattered. Bumpy's death did not simply create a vacancy in organized crime. It ended the life of a complicated public figure. The people who remembered his generosity remembered it. The people who remembered his criminal career remembered that too. The two versions existed together. A gangster could help children at Christmas. A feared figure could help a struggling family. A man accused of serious crimes could still be loved by people who knew him personally. That contradiction made Bumpy difficult to categorize. And perhaps that is why the simplified movie version never completely captured him. The real Bumpy was not clean. He was not purely noble. He was not purely monstrous. He was a man who lived inside a brutal system and learned how to survive it. That was enough to make him complicated, and it was enough to make his legacy last. Frank Lucas would eventually face his own reckoning with the federal government. His empire would fall. His freedom would disappear. The money would not last forever. The legend would. That was the pattern. Bumpy, Lucas, different generations, different methods. Same basic lesson. Nothing lasts. Not money, not power, not fear, not even a reputation. Unless somebody remembers. And Harlem remembered Bumpy. That was the part Frank Lucas could never change. He could become bigger than Bumpy in newspapers. He could become more famous through film. He could tell his version of the relationship. But every time the story began, there was still an older name waiting at the beginning, Bumpy Johnson. And that was the final twist. The younger man did not erase the old king. He helped preserve him. Every interview about Bumpy kept the name alive. Every disagreement about their relationship kept people asking questions. Every movie scene brought another generation back to Harlem. And every time someone asked whether Frank Lucas had replaced Bumpy, they were admitting something without realizing it. Bumpy still mattered. The old news had become history, and history is difficult to kill. Micro hook. Bumpy's empire was gone. His body was gone. His voice was gone. But his name was still sitting inside Frank Lucas's story. And the next chapter would ask the question nobody in Harlem could answer for him. What survives when the people who knew the truth are finally gone? There is a moment after a man dies when the world becomes very quiet around his name. Not immediately. At first, there are flowers, there are photographs, there are people telling stories, there are newspaper articles. People remember the loud things, the arrests, the money, the enemies, the reputation. Then the years begin, and the noise gets smaller. That is what happened to Bumpy Johnson. The man who had once been discussed in Harlem restaurants, police stations, courtrooms, and back rooms, slowly became a memory. Not a forgotten memory. A complicated one. People remembered different Bumpies. Some remembered the gangster. Some remembered the man who helped families. Some remembered the intelligence. Some remembered the fear. Some remembered the clothes. Some remembered his wife, Mamie. Some remembered the stories they had heard from their parents. And almost nobody remembered exactly the same man. That was the silence. Not the absence of stories, the absence of certainty, because Bumpy was dead. He could no longer explain himself. He could not correct a newspaper. He could not challenge a movie. He could not sit across from Frank Lucas and say, "That's not how it happened." The silence belonged to everyone who remained. And Frank Lucas remained for years. Lucas carried his own version of the past. He became increasingly famous. His story became larger. The public wanted to know how he had risen. They wanted to know who had taught him. They wanted to know what Harlem looked like before his empire. And again, the answer led backward. Bumpy. But there was something almost poetic about that. The younger man had spent his life trying to move beyond the old world. Yet the old world kept following him. Bumpy's name followed Lucas into interviews. It followed him into books. It followed him into documentaries. And eventually it followed him onto the movie screen. That was how Bumpy survived. Not through an empire, through association. The younger man became famous. The older man's name became attached to the fame, but Mame Johnson was still there. She had no reason to romanticize Bumpy. She had lived with him. She knew the ordinary man behind the extraordinary reputation. She knew what it meant to be married to someone whose name could change the temperature of a room, and she knew that public memory was not the same thing as private reality. That was why her objections mattered. She was not simply arguing about Frank Lucas. She was fighting over Bumpy's identity. Who was he? What had his life really been? Who had been close to him? What had he actually done? And what had later generations invented? Because the truth was not dramatic enough. Mamie's version did not erase Bumpy's criminal history. It complicated it. That was important, because the temptation with legends is always to choose one side. Hero, villain, king, victim. Bumpy did not fit neatly into any of them. He was a criminal. He was also a husband. He was a father. He was a friend. He was a benefactor to some Harlem residents. He was feared by others. He operated inside a violent system. He also understood the people living beneath that system. Those contradictions are uncomfortable, but they are human. And once the cameras arrive, uncomfortable truths are usually the first things to disappear. The movie version needs a beginning, a middle, an ending. The real Bumpy had none of those. His life was a series of unfinished stories. His criminal career did not end with a dramatic defeat. He died. His marriage continued in memory. His reputation continued. His influence continued. His enemies continued living. His friends continued aging. Harlem continued changing. That is what makes history different from cinema. Cinema can close the door. History leaves it open. And Bumpy's door stayed open for decades. Frank Lucas's own story eventually became complicated too. The empire ended. The money disappeared. The federal government caught up with him. The famous detective story became another part of the mythology. The man who had once seemed untouchable eventually discovered the same truth Bumpy had already learned. Power has an expiration date. Sometimes the government takes it. Sometimes another criminal takes it. Sometimes your body takes it. Sometimes history simply moves on. Lucas survived long enough to tell his story. Bumpy did not. That difference matters. One man got to narrate his own legend. The other became dependent on people who remembered him. And memory is unreliable. Merit changes with age. It changes with pride. It changes with guilt. It changes with love. It changes with what happened afterward. A person remembers an event differently after becoming famous than they remembered it before. A person remembers a relationship differently after the other person is gone. That does not automatically mean someone is lying. It means memory is not a recording. It is an interpretation. That is why the disagreement between Frank Lucas and Mame Johnson is so revealing. Lucas remembered Bumpy as an important mentor. Mame remembered a much less intimate relationship. Both had reasons to remember. Both occupied different positions. Lucas was the younger man looking upward. Mame was the wife looking across. Those are different perspectives, and perhaps the truth sits somewhere between them. Maybe Bumpy gave Lucas lessons. Maybe Lucas absorbed more than Bumpy realized. Maybe the relationship was important to Lucas precisely because Bumpy represented something he wanted to become. Maybe Mame was right that Lucas was never the central figure later stories made him. There is no need to force a perfect answer. The uncertainty itself is part of the history. That is the silence, the unanswered space, the place where the dead man's voice should be. And perhaps that is why Bumpy remains interesting. If everything were known, the legend would eventually become boring. But it isn't. We know enough to understand the man. We don't know enough to close every question. That keeps him alive in a different way. Not physically, historically. Harlem still carries traces of people like Bumpy, because cities remember. A restaurant closes. A building changes owners. A neighborhood changes its name. A generation moves away. But somebody remembers what was there. Somebody says, Bumpy used to sit here. Bumpy knew that man. Bumpy helped somebody's family. Bumpy was dangerous. Bumpy was generous. Bumpy was complicated. That is how legends actually survive. Not through perfect stories, through imperfect memories. The same thing happened to Frank Lucas. His public image became larger than his criminal record. The movie became larger than the interviews. The interviews became larger than the evidence. And the evidence became difficult for ordinary people to separate from the legend. That is the danger of the gangster myth. It turns human beings into symbols. Bumpy becomes the old king. Lucas becomes the new king. Then the real people disappear. But real people are where the truth lives. Bumpy's real life was not a movie. He was not born knowing how to control Harlem. He learned. He made mistakes. He went to prison. He came home. He aged. He tried to change. He remained connected to people. Then he died at a restaurant. That is less glamorous than the legend. It is also more powerful because it is real. And perhaps the most important thing about Bumpy's final years is what he did not do. He did not leave Harlem in a blaze of glory. He did not die in a shootout. He did not publicly crown a successor. He did not get the final word. He simply disappeared from the physical world. The streets continued. The younger men continued. Frank Lucas continued, and the stories began. Years became decades. Decades became movies. Movies became memory. And memory became mythology. But underneath all of it remained one quiet fact. Bumpy Johnson had been there before Frank Lucas. Before American Gangster. Before the interviews. Before people began arguing over who had really known whom. Bumpy had lived through Harlem's transformation. He had left fingerprints on its history, and no later story could remove them. That is why calling him old news ultimately misses the deeper point. Old news disappears. Bumpy did not. His criminal empire disappeared. His physical presence disappeared. His influence in the streets eventually disappeared. But the historical question remained. Who was Bumpy Johnson really? And why did a younger man who built his own enormous legend still need the old man's name to explain where he came from? There may never be a perfect answer. Maybe there shouldn't be. Because history is sometimes strongest where the silence begins. The people who were there are gone. The rooms are gone. The conversations are gone. The sound of the restaurant is gone. The coffee cup is gone. The chair is gone. All that remains is what people remember. And what people remember is never exactly the same as what happened. That is the final lesson of Bumpy Johnson. Not that he was invincible. He wasn't. Not that he controlled everything. He didn't. Not that Frank Lucas simply inherited his empire. The record does not support that. The lesson is simpler. A man's power can end while his meaning continues. Bumpy died in 1968, but the argument over Bumpy never died. That is why he still matters. That is why Frank Lucas could become famous and still have to answer questions about him. That is why Mame Johnson's corrections still matter. And that is why the movie version should never be mistaken for the whole story. Because somewhere between the legend Frank Lucas told and the memories Mamie Johnson defended was a man who had no voice left to settle the argument. Bumpy Johnson, the old man, the gangster, the husband, the Harlem figure, the complicated human being. And finally, the silence. Micro hook. The empire ended. The legend didn't. And perhaps that was Bumpy Johnson's strangest victory. Frank Lucas could inherit the future, but Bumpy had already become part of the past, and the past is much harder to replace. The story begins with a question: was Bumpy Johnson old news? By the time Frank Lucas became famous, It was easy to believe the answer was yes. Bumpy was dead. His empire was gone. His generation had passed. The streets had changed. The drugs had changed. The money had changed. And Frank Lucas had built something that reached far beyond the Harlem world Bumpy had known. But history has a strange habit. It asks you to look backward. And when you do, you find Bumpy still standing there. Not in the streets, not behind a restaurant table, not giving orders. In the story, that is where he survived. Frank Lucas became famous for his own reasons. He built his own organization. He took enormous risks. He became one of the most recognizable names associated with Harlem's heroin trade. His story eventually reached books, interviews, documentaries, and Hollywood. But every time people asked where this story began, Harlem pulled them backward, to the generation before Lucas, to the neighborhood before the legend, to Bumpy Johnson. That does not mean Bumpy created everything Frank Lucas became. The evidence does not support such a simple conclusion. Their relationship remains disputed. Frank Lucas described Bumpy as a mentor and father figure. Mame Johnson remembered a much less intimate relationship. The exact truth may never be recovered completely, and perhaps that uncertainty is important, because Bumpy's real legacy was never simply that he taught Frank Lucas how to become a gangster. His legacy was the world Lucas entered. Bumpy had already shown what power looked like in Harlem. He had shown the importance of relationships. He had shown the value of patience. He had shown how a man could become feared without constantly displaying violence. He had shown that reputation could become stronger than physical presence. And he had shown something else. Power always changes. Bumpy's generation controlled one kind of Harlem. Lucas's generation built another. Neither could stop time. Bumpy could not. Lucas could not. That is the part gangster stories often leave out. The empire always looks permanent while the money is coming in. The cars are moving. The phones are ringing. The people are answering. The doors are opening. Then one day the phone stops ringing. The people stop answering. The door stays closed. And the man who thought he owned the city discovers that he only rented his place in history. Bumpy understood that before most people did. Maybe that was why he never needed to announce himself. He had already seen men become powerful. He had already watched them lose it. He knew that fear was temporary, money was temporary, even influence was temporary, but memory could last. And Harlem remembered. That is why the funeral mattered. That is why Mamie Johnson's memories mattered. That is why the arguments over Frank Lucas mattered. Because they were not simply arguments about two criminals. They were arguments about who gets to define the past. Frank Lucas had his version. Mame Johnson had hers. Hollywood created another. And somewhere underneath those versions was the historical Bumpy Johnson, a complicated man, a criminal, a husband, a community figure, a survivor, a man whose life cannot be reduced to a crown. He did not become powerful because he was invincible. He became powerful because he understood people. He understood timing. He understood Harlem. And he understood that the most dangerous thing a man can do is assume the world will remain the same forever. It won't. Harlem changed. Bumpy changed. Lucas changed. America changed. The drug trade changed. The law changed. And eventually, the stories changed too. That is why Frank Lucas never really proved Bumpy Johnson wrong. If anything, Lucas proved something else. He proved that the next generation could build something larger. But building something larger is not the same as erasing what came before. The younger man can become richer, more famous, more notorious. He can even become the character millions of people recognize first, but he cannot change the fact that another man helped shape the world he entered. Bumpy's name remained attached to Harlem because he had become part of its historical memory. And that is a different kind of power. A criminal empire has employees. A legend has descendants. People who never met Bumpy still know the name. People who never walked through the Harlem of the 1940s can still picture him. Some know him from books, some from interviews, some from stories told by older relatives. Some know him because Frank Lucas's story eventually led back to him, and some know him because Hollywood turned him into a character. But behind every version is the same man, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, Bumpy. He was not a superhero. He was not a misunderstood saint. He was not simply a villain. He was a man who lived inside one of the most complicated periods in Harlem's history, and found a way to survive longer than many of the people around him. That is enough. More than enough. And maybe the most important lesson is this. Frank Lucas did not need Bumpy Johnson to become Frank Lucas. But Frank Lucas could not erase Bumpy Johnson from the history of Harlem. That is the difference between influence and ownership. You can build your own empire. You cannot own the past. The past belongs to everyone who remembers it, and Bumpy had been remembered for too long to become old news. His streets changed, his enemies disappeared, his money vanished, his body returned to the earth. But his name remained. That is why the story survives. Not because Bumpy won every battle. He didn't. Not because he controlled Harlem forever. He didn't. Not because every story told about him is true. It isn't. The story survives because Bumpy represents something larger than the criminal world. He represents the generation before the generation that became famous, the man before the myth, the history beneath the movie. And perhaps that is the real reason Frank Lucas's legend keeps leading backward. Every time someone asks how the young king rose, an older name appears, Bumpy Johnson, not as a ghost, not as a mastermind pulling strings from beyond the grave, simply as the man who was there first. And sometimes that is enough, because the strongest legacy is not the one that controls the future. It is the one the future cannot stop mentioning. Bumpy died in 1968. Frank Lucas went on to become famous. Hollywood eventually turned their stories into entertainment. Mame Johnson kept defending the memory of her husband, and history kept asking the same question. Who was Bumpy Johnson, really? Maybe there is no single answer. Maybe there shouldn't be, because the real man was always more complicated than the legend. And that complexity is what makes him worth remembering. So if Frank Lucas ever believed the old world was finished, he was right about one thing. The world had changed, but he was wrong about another. Bumpy Johnson was never just the world. He was part of the foundation beneath it. And foundations do not need to be visible to keep holding the building up. That is the final truth. Frank Lucas could become the new name. Bumpy remained the old one. And decades later, people are still saying both. That means the story never really belonged to one man. It belonged to Harlem, to the streets, to the people who lived there, to the people who remembered, and to the space between history and legend. Because sometimes the man everyone calls old news is the one whose name refuses to disappear. Bumpy Johnson's empire ended. His life ended. His era ended. But his legacy didn't. It was carried forward by every story that came after him, including Frank Lucas's. And that may be the closest thing Bumpy ever had to a final victory. Not that he defeated the younger man. Not that he stopped him. Not that he remained king forever. But that the younger man's legend still needed the older man's name. Some men leave money. Some leave buildings. Some leave fear. Bumpy left a question, and Harlem has been answering it ever since. Who gets to tell the story of the man who came before? That question is still open, and maybe that's why Bumpy Johnson was never really old news. He was history, and history does not disappear, it waits. Then somebody remembers. If you want more stories where the legend and the historical record collide, stay with us. The next story may begin with a name you think you already know, and end with a truth you never heard.